Good morning, everyone. I think we've got just about everyone in the room. Oh, there's a few more just jumping in. So we'll just give them a second to get connected. And I think we have everyone in the room. So thank you so much for joining us today. Based on the interest level that we've received, we know the reopening of your respective business is heavy on your minds. And we believe we've got a really great lineup of topical people practices to chat about today. Those that we believe you as leaders in your organization need to be focused on before you actually go about opening those doors. So, just a few housekeeping items before we get started. This format is going to be slightly different than you might be accustomed to, and we recognize that most of you are probably zoomed out. And so we want this really to be a little more informal. It's a Q&A conversation that we are having with three panelists. And along the way, the chat box is going to be open to collect your questions and your comments. So feel free to use that. My colleague Tracy Johnson will be monitoring the chat box along the way, and she'll bring to my attention those things that are pertinent to address. We will be recording the conversation today, and certainly we'll share a copy of it with you early next week. So through the conversation, we'd appreciate it if you kept your volume muted until such time that we get to the Q&A session, and at that stage, we would welcome you to open up your volume. So let's get started, and I'll just be sharing a screen with you shortly. And if you could use your reaction button just to let me know that you're seeing things okay. So give me a thumbs up. All right, excellent. Looks like everybody's seeing what they need to be seeing. So we'll get started. So here we are at our new normal. To say that lots has changed since COVID was officially announced late January would be an understatement. Who would have thought that in our lifetime we would bear witness to a global reaction of school closures, business and retail closures, borders are closed, and last but not least, the restrictions that are placed on our movements by way of physical distancing. A whole new world for us to live in. But with what we might think has been some bad, there are some good things out of what COVID has brought to us. We have reportedly lower levels of pollution. Our waterways are clearer. We can actually see fish swimming in brooks. And we can enjoy these Crayola crayon skies, I call them, that are being shared courtesy of the Sky Over Corona Facebook group. People are posting these fantastic photos of sunrise and sunset right across the globe for people to enjoy and to find the good in all that's happening. So April 27th, the Ontario government announced its approach to gradually opening the province. And as you can see, we are now at the restart phase. Protect phase was really that physical distancing, locked down, staying at home, working from home, homeschooling, all of those things. And we're now at phase two, where there has been slight loosening of that lockdown protocol, where there are select businesses that have been opened. So those that could provide curbside services. Hardware stores have reopened, and they're allowing some small gatherings. So for instance, those individuals who need to attend a funeral, there is some loosening of those kinds of restrictions. So stage 1 started May 19th. Stage 2 could potentially start as early as June 1st to June 15 in that window. And that's going to all be dependent on the chief medical officer's perspective as to whether the curve is being maintained at a level that they're comfortable to see it at. So we're interested to hear from you. Where's your organization at as it relates to its readiness? If the government said tomorrow that your organization could open June 8th, how ready are you? You should see a launch poll coming your way in seconds. Just register your answer there. Almost there, just a few more. And I think we've got one more to come. Yes, perfect. So here we are. So we've got 8% of those that are participating today who are fully prepared, 17% nearly prepared, 50% somewhat prepared, 25% somewhat unprepared. All right, so let's see how you fare against conference board numbers. So here's our reality check. We actually are in line with what the conference board is saying. 8% of organizations are fully prepared to reopen, and pretty much similar numbers. Our numbers were 50%. Here we see 48% are somewhat prepared. So we are having this conversation, I think, at a good time, because there's a lot of work that needs to get done in order for organizations to be ready. Now, one of the other realities is the impact that COVID has had on your employees. CAMH has done some work to understand how COVID is affecting Ontarians. And 90% of Ontarians are feeling that COVID has significantly impacted the economy. 69% of Ontarians they're frightened for their own personal finances, not sure how they're going to pay that mortgage, that car loan, their kids' tuition bills. 59% of employees or Ontarians are suggesting that they are really having difficulty working in isolation. It's not what they signed up for, and they're not able to find a way to get comfortable with it working from their home situation. So that's just a few ways in which COVID is impacting. And so today we have 3 panelists here to help us think through what things are we supposed to be doing and thinking about before we even begin to open our doors next week, or 2 weeks, or 3 weeks from now. And so I'm just going to take a quick second here just to double check that I'm not missing anything in the chat. All right. Yes, Sandy, we are definitely talking about Ontario only, but I do know that many of the other provinces are taking a similar phased-in approach. You'd really have to take a look at each province specifically, because the protocols are situated for the nuances of each of those different provinces. So for sure, we're talking about Ontario only. All right, we'll carry on. So Graham Imrie, our resident HR practitioner, is a Toronto-based independent consultant. He provides services in recruitment, human resources, change management, career counseling, and stakeholder relations. We have Stuart Rudner of Rudner Law. He's an employment lawyer and a mediator. And his firm has been recognized by Best Lawyers for the past 4 years running. His law practice specializes in employment and labor law, as well as mediation services related to employment matters. And he offers advice and counsel to all sizes of organizations and sectors in the province of Ontario. And we have Theo West Parks of West Parks and Associates as our workspace creative designer. Theo has over 25 years experience in the industry, providing full interior design and project management to a broad range of corporate, commercial, and healthcare clients, again, in the province of Ontario. And so I'm going to just stop sharing my screen so that we can focus on our speakers. And I'm going to ask Graham to unmute, as he's going to be kicking off the conversation with leading the charge on the reopening strategy. So keeping form before function in mind, it makes sense that leaders are giving some good thought to the goals, objectives that might have been set earlier in the fiscal year, and whether those goals and objectives still make sense. So what's the first thing leadership should be doing? What should they be focusing on?
Thanks, Veronica, and good morning, everyone. So as the human resources practitioner, I would say start at the level of the self. And one of the things I think is really important to call out from the off is to consciously take ourselves as leaders and HR leaders out of adrenaline mode. There's been so much reacting to an onslaught of information that's been evolving very, very quickly, and react. And so I think the first step is to say, okay, we need to pull back from adrenaline mode, and really to frame the organization's situation for each of the steps that come after. And so it looks from the poll like some organizations might be further ahead than others, but I would suggest asking some really critical questions about where the organization is right now. Are we in existential mode? Are we a going concern risk? Or do we have a secure base of revenue and demand from which we're working with, or anything on that spectrum? And then I think for each of the steps that come next, really placing a fresh set of eyes on the organization's strategic plan, and identifying whether there's new risks or opportunities, or for nonprofits, imperatives on the mission side that have now risen to the top of that plan. And one of the things I think is really foundational, many organizations created task forces and war rooms for the initial COVID response. I would start to think about how we either create or reposition such task forces to get engagement in the various questions and decisions that are going to have to follow in the restart phase.
Okay, so given everything is so fluid, what's a reasonable, simple approach that leaders can take to revisit their strategic plan?
Yeah, so I find myself going back to a high school teacher who was a mentor, whose expression was "keep it simple, stupid." And so I think you don't need to look for a lot of science necessarily, but start with the obvious. If the business or components of the business or things that involve travel or large groups congregating, then are they core to the offering? Does revenue depend on them? And depending on these questions, can they be adapted into other formats? I think if the organization has an organized annual plan in place, part of the level setting at this stage might be to look at variances compared to where we projected that we'd be at this stage, assuming that that plan was developed before COVID. And again, asking questions, is this realistic? Are there ways to get on track? Have we been able to keep up our business to a satisfactory degree during COVID? Or do we need to revisit some of the deliverables that we assumed? And if we do need to revisit those assumptions, then who needs to be involved in that? What stakeholders?
Okay.
I think just to go back to the information, you alluded to there being so much. Environmental scanning is going to continue to be really key. And so I think that appointing one or a couple of people to really kind of be your eyes on the information coming in from the world is going to be important. And finally, just to put on what I call COVID glasses and take a very literal approach to your plan. You know, if your plan spoke to access or to growth, or like some organizations endeavoring to be an employer of choice, what do these things really mean in the COVID world?
All right. And so, one of the questions I've been hearing is, things are fluid, but here we are in reopening, and there's still so much that's unknown. How can leaders at this stage assess whether it's the right time to restructure the organization, or should they just take that wait and see approach?
Yeah, so I think this goes back to my initial comment about framing. Realistically, depending on the situation, there might be no option. So I think, as in pre-COVID times, the HR leaders and leaders really need to ask critically what it is that is driving restructuring. Restructuring is a means to an end rather than an end itself. And so, is it cost savings that are driving the restructuring ideas, or is it a strategic pivot to a new area or a new opportunity that's come up? I think the tricky balance here is short-term versus long-termism, with the risk of taking a wait-and-see approach being that I might put excessive pressure on the organization's reserves, or on the human side, it might put pressure on staff's stay intentions. Just the pressure of being kept in a holding pattern for too long. So I think it's really important to let your read on the culture inform that decision.
So people have been working from home for a number of weeks, and I shared earlier some of the stats from CAMH on the impact of COVID-19 on mental health. What should a re-engagement approach look like?
Well, I think, again, from the human perspective, I would suggest that most teams will need to start with some level of healing. And, I think for a lot of people, even if they've kept their jobs and done this work from home pivot, COVID-19 will have been a seminal event for a lot of people. And I think, to me, it's really a prerequisite to check in with staff first and really gauge where they're at, feeling, confusion, loss, trauma, or whatever that might look like. I think my watchword with this would be some degree of measured flexibility. If you've been through your strategic and operating plans, there's going to be some level of reconciliation that needs to happen with what you're hearing from your staff. And I think it would also be a safe assumption that you might not get all your people back at all, or perhaps not in the way that they worked before.
Right.
I think to put a data point on it, maybe some insights from a survey or forum could validate what you think that your read on that is.
So we have a question coming from participants, and the question is, what does a level of healing look like?
The level of healing. I think at the organization level, this is why I would encourage data, because at the individual level, it's going to be so situational. The level for healing, perhaps I'm an employee with generalized anxiety, and it's exacerbated by the pressure of work and COVID. It might just simply be that my productivity is down and I'm an achiever profile and I want to get back up. So I think it's hard to answer that, but I would encourage some combination of data and human qualitative touch points.
So, how does a manager even go about redirecting an employee's energy and focus on the task at hand when really they've been in firefighting mode for the last 6 to 8 weeks?
Yeah. So I think to that point, the kind of war room fatigue is being recognized now as a legitimate thing. And I think that one technique is maybe to start to rotate people out of the war room and get back focused on the plan while others keep in that sort of reaction mode. I have what I like to call stop, start, continue exercises, which might be anything that was an extraordinary measure related to COVID. We inventory that and say, is it safe and productive to stop this now, or do we need to evolve it or continue in its current fashion in order to get back on our plan? And I think carving out time for evaluation. I think in organization project kind of life cycles, the evaluation component is always the one that gets dropped.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that this one it's more critical than ever to really take what in the healthcare quality improvement world we use the language of what went well, even better if, and that can really legitimize if you need to sustain some of your new practices, or make them permanent.
Right. And so the reality of the landscape as we once knew it hasn't, and it will continue to evolve. And so the way HR was designed and managed even 2 months ago will need some dusting off. Everything from how we recruit to the different learning and training that staff will need to those behaviors that you valued that will be important to reward and recognize, just to name a few. What effects has COVID had on the job market?
So there are statistics out there about job losses in the millions. I think in terms of the durable effect, it's probably a bit too soon to say. We could surmise that there might be more available labour from the service sector, for example, that younger workers are still in the market. I think a new factor is disincentives to work, whether it's the fear of contracting COVID, mm-hmm. or in some cases the new competition between what you pay and government aid that's available, particularly when you've got part-time workers that you rely on. So I think when we're talking about what we used to call employer value proposition, we really have to look critically at is there compensation in the short and medium term still attractive, and are we being as assertive about our working conditions as, for example, retailers are being about how they're making their stores safe for you when they reopen.
Mm-hmm. So with that in mind, how can organizations safely recruit, onboard, and train new employees, particularly those who have traditionally been reliant on work that's front-facing?
Mm-hmm. So this is one that I have seen a lot of HR COVID wisdom emerging, and this is one where I'm not really seeing a lot. I think that in terms of my own practice, it might be time to revisit some of the some old techniques like case studying or work simulation. I think that it's a little bit counterintuitive, but if you have to bring on like HR people or sales people who are traditionally been very face-to-face type activities, it really calls for more upfront investment in the online alternatives, and really spending that time upfront and designing selection questions to really kind of get to the heart of employees' profiles and their ability to develop a relationship with you.
So, from a practical standpoint, what are some of the policies and practices that organizations are going to have to immediately pay attention to before they open their doors?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm not sure if Stuart will cover it in more legal depth after, but I think for me, what comes to mind is workplace accommodations, individual accommodation planning in view of new COVID limitations. It probably is prudent to review them right now. I think occupational health and safety has been really very focused on PPE, but with vast swathes of the workforce potentially being at home for the foreseeable future, considering home as the workplace, it probably is time to put attention to the internal responsibility system for home workers. And I think this is a good time as well to look at policies and practices around things like bring your own device and office equipment procurement, because so much stuff was rushed out the door in order to keep people productive, and they still are the organization's assets, and I think it's a good time to take stock of that.
I'm even thinking, some of the confidentiality and intellectual property elements of terms and conditions, how are stakeholder information being kept under lock and key, so to speak, in an environment that may not be as controllable when it's at home. So yes, absolutely, some of those for sure. Thank you, Graham. We're going to move on to Stuart Rudner and some of the legal implications that are coming out of COVID-19. So Stuart, having heard from Graham that organizations might well be rethinking their goals and objectives, and this whole exercise will have trickling effects on structure and potentially jobs and those jobs that are connected to people, what approach should employers be taking to recall employees back to work, particularly those who were laid off?
Yeah, thanks, Veronica. And I just want to point out, I know we had that question about whether this is focused on Ontario, and obviously we're all in Ontario. I think almost everything I have to say would apply across the country. There may be some nuances as far as employment standards legislation, but for the most part, the principles will apply. And we work with clients across the country. Other which of course has its own legal regime. And from a legal perspective, to get back to your question, yeah, I think we have to remember that businesses are not in the habit of laying employees off. This is an entirely new experience in the context of this unprecedented pandemic that we're going through. So there's no shortage of questions. And as you start to get back to business, if not back to normal, everyone's trying to figure out how you do that. And for most of the clients we're working with, they're not in a position to go back to 100% capacity overnight. So it's going to be a gradual or a staggered process. And what we've been telling our clients is the first thing is to consider what are your operational needs. So assess which roles you're going to want to need or want to have back right away. And then as part of that, assess who can work remotely, because that's still the preferred method of controlling the spread of the virus, is to have people work from home. For others that can't work remotely, consider whether or how you can achieve physical distancing. We have a lot of clients who are working, and maybe Theo will talk about this, about reconfiguring the workplace and assessing how many people you can fit in the workplace. Then you're going to require. And just on that point, there are so many myths out there. And the most common one being that if you recall people from a layoff, you've got to do it in order of seniority, or the first person laid off has to be the first person brought back. None of those are true. Now, if you are unionized, if you have a collective agreement, then yes, your collective agreement will set out a very clear process. Otherwise, you can really pick and choose who you're going to recall and when, based upon any criteria or no criteria at all. The only exception being human rights. Obviously, you can't choose based upon gender, racial background, disability, and that's important because COVID-19 is being recognized as a disability. So if someone tested positive, let's say back in March or April, and now, of course, they're clear to return to the workplace, you could not choose not to bring them back because of that. That would be a breach of their human rights. Other than that, you can pick and choose who you want to bring back when. Be mindful of time limits on layoffs. So if you did lay somebody off, every province has its own time limits for how long someone can be on a layoff before it's a deemed termination, at which point your severance obligations will kick in. So be mindful of that. And just back to your question, Veronica, about process, once you've made those decisions, the next step is to develop a safety plan and make sure that you are doing whatever is required in order to prevent the spread of the virus. And I think we're going to talk a bit about that more later on.
Okay. So once an organization has their plan sorted out, how might the CEWS program be incorporated into that plan?
Yeah, the CEWS program, the emergency wage subsidy, is to me a game changer. I mean, I know not everyone's thrilled with it at the implementation. There's obviously issues, but for a program of that scope that was brought in so quickly, I think they've done a pretty good job. And very quickly, the federal government will pay up to 75% of an employee's wages, and it doesn't matter whether they are working or not. So you've really got two groups of people here. You've got your employees who are coming back to work, so will be working. You can certainly rely upon the CEWS, assuming you meet the other criteria, which are mostly focused on loss of revenue. And then once the federal government pays that 75%, you can top up the rest. You don't have to. The government has said that they expect you to make best efforts to do so. They haven't really defined exactly what that means. But the point is, you can have people back and working and not be paying their full salary, which will be a real godsend for a lot of organizations. But also for those that you don't need back, the whole idea here is to get them off layoff. So you can recall them from layoff, even if they're not working, take advantage of the subsidy. And even if you can't top that up, at least they're getting 75% of their wages. They're off the layoff, and it's not costing you as an employer anything.
So we know that we need to recognize that there are some staff who just aren't going to be willing to come back, or they're just not going to be in a position to return to work. What reasons can an employee give if they refuse to return to work?
Yeah, this is a question that we are getting a lot of, and it's understandable. I mean, people have various reasons for not wanting to go back to work, or in some cases being unable to. So I think it's important to start with this point. Work is not an option. And it's no different now if you were on a layoff and now you're being recalled than it would have been back in the old days, so to speak. If you worked on a Monday and Tuesday, you couldn't just decide not to work on Wednesday. Mm-hmm. It's not optional. So generally speaking, if you refuse to work, you're abandoning your job. It's essentially a resignation. There are three scenarios in the current context where people could essentially refuse to work. One is where there is a leave of absence available. So in Ontario and in most provinces, employment standards legislation was amended to allow for various leaves that are COVID-19 related. So if you cannot work, and I stress the word cannot as opposed to choose not to work, then you may be entitled to a leave. Otherwise, there is always accommodation under human rights legislation. So if you're entitled to accommodation for childcare obligations, or because you have a medical condition, you're immunocompromised, you may be entitled to accommodation, which doesn't necessarily mean not working. And I think we'll get back to that. The third exception is the right to refuse unsafe work, which I know we're going to talk about as well. But simply put, if the workplace is unsafe, then there is a right to refuse. But those are the three exceptions. Other than that, you can't just choose not to go back to work.
So an employee chooses not to come back to work. What steps should the employer now take?
And legal only, it's also practical. We realize that there may be legal theories but there's also practical realities. And especially in this current environment where we're all trying to figure out what to do, you got to take into account the circumstances. So communication is key. First thing to do is just find out why they are saying they can't come back to work or don't want to come back to work. Maybe they have a legitimate reason, like one of the exceptions I just mentioned. If they do, obviously you'll have to respect that. If not, assess if you need them back. As I said earlier, and as I think we've all kind of acknowledged, not all organizations aren't going to be able to bring everyone back at once. So if you have an employee who's saying, I prefer not to come back, that might actually make your choice a lot easier. So if you had 10 employees, you can only bring back 8. Here's one who's volunteering not to come back. So, sorry about that. So if you have someone who can't come back, that might actually be in everyone's best interest and a win-win. But if you need this person back and they don't seem to have a legitimate reason for refusing, then I think you can do, like lawyers always say, document. Put it in writing, make it very clear, give them a warning that if they don't come back, then they're going to be deemed to abandon their job. And hopefully at that point, they'll get good advice and realize that their position is pretty tenuous.
So in this world of COVID, what does the duty to accommodate now look like?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And of course, all of these questions about how courts and tribunals are going to treat the world of COVID, we're not going to have answers for years. I've talked to a lot of people about constructive dismissal and the fact that many employers who laid people off probably didn't have the right to lay them off. How courts are going to treat that in the COVID-19 era, we're not going to know for years. But talking about human rights and accommodation, start from the proposition. I think we all know that under human rights legislation, an employer has a duty to accommodate things that are covered by human rights legislation, and disability, childcare obligations are the two primary ones in this situation or this discussion. The duty is to the point of undue hardship. So one thing we always tell our clients, anytime you get a request for accommodation, never dismiss it outright. Always take it seriously. Have a process in place. It's important to understand, though, that if someone asks you for accommodation, they've got to essentially justify it. They've got to produce documentation to show that there is a need for accommodation. And then you can assess if it's legitimate or not. And if so, then you assess whether you can accommodate and what the options might be. It's important to note as well, the employee can't insist upon their preferred form of accommodation. So I'll give you an example, Veronica. Let's talk about childcare. Somebody says that they need accommodation because their kids are at home, there's no school, there's no childcare, they are not able to come into work. So they need accommodation. So let's assume that they provide documentation to show, or they otherwise satisfy you, that there's no other option. Because again, maybe there's another relative, maybe there is childcare available. Whatever it is, you've got to be satisfied this is a need. And then if so, you then assess whether you can accommodate. And maybe you can accommodate them by allowing them to work from home. So it's not a matter of they cannot work. They can't insist upon that form of accommodation. Okay. If they can work from home, that's an accommodation. Maybe modified hours. Maybe they have a partner who can, look after the kids, but only after, noon. So then maybe they only work in the afternoons. Or I've actually had a few employer clients recently who've been looking into the viability of providing childcare for their staff for this very reason. That would be a form of accommodation. So you can look into the options, and you as the employer can implement reasonable accommodation. It's not the preferred choice of the employee. And I'll say it again, document all of these considerations very carefully.
So we have a question in which is an interesting one. So the individual is willing to come back to work, but they're not interested to take TTC, mass communications, for fear of, whatever that fear might be. What are some of the commuting alternatives, or what kinds of accommodations would an employer have to make in that regard?
Yeah, I think I get this question daily, and I guess it's understandable. And it's interesting because from a legal perspective, you start from the proposition that the employer has to ensure the workplace is safe. They don't have to ensure that your method of transportation to and from the workplace is safe. And the same way we've often said, if someone is routinely late for work and they blame the TTC, that's not an excuse, and you're entitled to insist that they come to work. In theory, the same would apply in this context, where you could insist that they have to get themselves to work, and it's really not the employer's obligation to facilitate that. That being said, we are in very different who are trying to accommodate. Some have actually been paying for Uber for their staff to get to work. Some have been instituting carpools, which you want to make it as safe as you can, but they have been doing that. So there are ways that I've heard of where employers are trying to address this concern, because it is an understandable one. I've also heard where it's just again, modifying hours. So some people said, they'll take the TTC, but not in rush hour when it's so crowded. So adjusting their hours to allow them to do that. Or again, if they can work from home, that's still, the best way to prevent any spread of the virus.
All right. So we know the whole premise of physical distancing protocol is to help reduce the spread of COVID. And while grocery stores and pharmacists and manufacturers have demonstrated some best practices in terms of how we can share common spaces, the office environment has some of its own interesting nuances that might be challenging as it relates to mitigating those hazards and risks that might be inherent to working in an office environment. So what proactive measures should employers be taking to help reduce the risk of spreading COVID among their employees?
Yes, I think there's got to be a real assessment of the workplace. If you have a health and safety committee, now's the time to activate them, or an individual who's responsible. They may not have a lot of work most times. Now they certainly will. And the workplace, most workplaces are, have various sections to them, so to speak. So as I've said a few times already, working from home is still, isolation is still the preferred way to maintain safety. If you can't, then distancing and reconfiguring your workplace. Also, we've talked a lot about PPE, but just, cleaning, sanitizing the workplace. I got a great suggestion from a client about a week ago of making sure your HVAC system is as clean as it should, as efficient as it should be. Providing simple things like soap and hand sanitizer. The other important point too is it's not one size fits all. So we've certainly got clients who are looking at building their plans, and they've got some employees who will work from home. They've got some who will work in the workplace, but they have reconfigured the workplace so everyone is physically distant, and they've got very clear rules in place for only one person in the kitchen at a time. If you're going to pass somebody in the hallway, you either one person ducks into an office, or you make sure that you don't come too close. If you're going to go talk to someone, you stay in the doorway. You don't go too close to their desk or to their cubicle. And then you may have some employees who will have to be more closer, either to other staff, to customers, to suppliers, in which case PPE becomes even more important. So different approaches for different people, but the bottom line is you need to assess the risks and then have very clear policies, which you communicate to everyone, both for two reasons really. Communicate to reassure everyone that you are taking reasonable steps to ensure the workplace is safe, but also to let them know what the expectations are of their conduct. So they know what is expected of them, and you can then enforce it if you have to. But communication is really going to be critical so everyone knows what is expected of them.
So we have a question that came in, and the question is, let me read it specifically. What is the current status with one who refuses to return to work, so on site, due to the concern that with exposure coming home to a household member, and it's not their own health status? So clearly the fear of perhaps contracting COVID from a coworker and having to then go home to your family members.
Yeah, it's a great question. So thank you for sending that in. I mean, it still would fall two potential categories. So leave of absence in Ontario and in some other provinces allows people to have a job protected leave of absence if they cannot work due to COVID-19. So you'd have to establish that they cannot work. There's a greater risk than usual. So for example, if they have a family member who is immunocompromised, then they may have a very legitimate concern about going out into public, going to work, which is different than the average person. Even if a leave of absence doesn't apply, we talked about accommodation under human rights, that would apply to this situation. So again, it's not the average person saying, I'm concerned because I don't want to go out and then infect my children. But if their children, if their family members have some additional risk that others don't, that essentially would be a disability, then there may well be an entitlement to accommodation. So every case obviously needs to be assessed on its own particular facts. It's not as simple as someone saying, I'm scared to go out in public. But if they can legitimately show a need, then there will be a duty to accommodate.
All right. Thanks, Stuart. We're going to move on to Theo in terms of creating that right work environment. And we've heard that, you know, there's a rethinking of goals. There's perhaps objectives that will shift. What steps can employers make to proactively plan for and prepare their work environments without breaking the bank?
Thanks, Veronica, and thanks, Graham and Stuart, for your comments, because I think there's a lot of overlap in what I have to say as far as the space and planning. I think it's critical before you even look at the space is to remember that the comfort, health, and safety of your employee is paramount to returning to the workplace. I think before any employer opens its doors, they should talk to their landlord. And has the landlord, what's their approach to managing the building? Have they sanitized the building? How are they controlling entrances and exits into the building? Access to the elevators, occupancy in the lobbies, use of tenant washrooms, and sanitizing the building, both in the public spaces and in the leased premises. I think every company should look at a staged and a phased return to work. Some firms are stretching that out over the whole year ahead. I've heard of companies where the last phase is looking at 2021 before going back to work. So it's really a very thoughtful, sort of long-term approach to opening its doors and how you're functioning. Some people are doing 50% in 3 days a week, 50% in another 3 days a week. So it's, again, a shared use of space over a long-term sort of application. And the other thing, on a very inexpensive, is really just to remove some of the furniture in areas where spacing is an issue, where people are congregating together, and putting some panels in place to divide the space up so people cannot gather in large groups. I think those are just sort of some key simple things.
So what would be the top 3 strategies that employers should focus on as it relates to refining the functionality of their work environment?
Yeah, I think really occupancy and circulation are the key things. Number one, I think everyone should review the layout of their space in a plan and the function of each area. So that would be reception, workstations, and meeting rooms, and any shared areas where you have to address self-distancing and the signage for self-distancing. Bottleneck areas where wayfinding and directional traffic may need to be documented, and occupancy signage developed for meeting rooms and shared spaces, where you're only going to be allowed to have maybe 50% of people in a room at one time. And due to the workstation layouts, you maybe only allow every second desk to be occupied, allowing for that self-distancing rule. Second, I would look at sanitation. And sanitation in critical areas for like entrances into your space, kitchen areas, and high traffic areas. Desks should have all their personal belongings removed except for computer, keyboard, to allow for cleaning on a day-to-day and sort of hour-by-hour basis. And wipes, sanitation wipes should be close to workstations so that the staff can clean their areas on an ongoing basis. And thirdly, housekeeping. Ensure that there's a deep cleaning of all the premises prior to occupancy, and there's a daily continuous cleaning and sanitation of areas like door handles, elevator buttons, restrooms, kitchen server areas, showroom yes allowing anybody to have coffee because they couldn't control cleaning of the area on a regular basis.
Now, what best practices are emerging as it relates to the workspaces being refined or repurposed? What are you seeing?
I think occupancy signage in any sort of shared rooms has to be sort of documented in a written format, indicating seating and arrangements for seating to make sure that fixed distancing is in place. And that would be outside of lunchrooms, outside of meeting areas, anything to ensure the safety of staff.
And what can employers be doing ahead of time to bring heightened profile and awareness to workplace hygiene?
I think, as Stuart mentioned, I think putting a document in place on corporate policies before people even enter the workspace or before they come back to work on what the new sort of workplace functions are going to be, workplace etiquette, flexibility, staggered hours of working. I think patience and flexibility moving forward is going to be key to making everybody use the space successfully and for people to feel comfortable and safe in their space.
All right. And so in terms of keeping workspace hygiene top of mind, what's the strategy here?
I think having sanitation spots at as many places as possible, reminding people to wash their hands on a regular basis, cleaning, keeping desks clean, so that really anything you touch you can put away. It's your personal belongings. It's really making sure that the space is cleanable and in a written format so that people understand before they arrive at their desk what the policy is in place.
Okay. Thank you for that, Theo. We're now 7 minutes to the top of the hour, and so we will happily take any additional questions. We do have one here. The question is, are office environments related to essential businesses, for instance, supply chain, are they allowed to reopen their physical workplace at this time? And I'll open that up to any one of our three panelists who can answer that.
I really don't know at this time. Maybe Stuart has a better understanding of that.
And sorry, I was looking, I don't think I see the question. Could you just repeat it again, Veronica?
Sure. Are office environments related to an essential business, like a supply chain, are they allowed to reopen their physical workplace at this time?
Got it. Okay, thank you. I mean, if it's an essential service, then you should be able to reopen. I mean, I would definitely double check that, and please don't rely upon this as legal advice. But if you're essential service, you should be able to reopen. But as we've all been saying, do it very cautiously.
Mm-hmm. And do we have any other questions coming in? Are we looking there, Tracy? Anything that we've missed along the way, or have we hit just about everything? We'll give you a couple minutes there. If you've got something that you want to ask, just simply type it into that chat box.
Hi, Veronica. All questions that have been submitted have been forwarded to you at this point.
All right. Well, I'm going to say then that we don't have any questions. Is there one? Okay.
I have one more question.
Got it. How prevalent
are?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
How prevalent are office workplace inspections occurring?
I can jump in and just comment on that. I mean, so there aren't, from what I've heard, there aren't a lot of independent inspections where the ministry is just sending somebody out. Typically, the process that someone feels that addressing it internally. But if they're unsatisfied, then they can make a complaint to the Ministry of Labor. I know that in Ontario, in particular, they have bolstered their resources substantially, anticipating a lot of calls. They've actually reached out to retired inspectors, among other people, to bring them back, and they are ready to answer calls. But it is generally responsive as opposed to being proactive. And in many cases, they don't even visit the workplace. They will just ask questions and try to assess the risks. So I haven't heard of many proactive inspections, but they have a lot of inspectors available to respond to calls. And I've heard they've already had several thousand.
I would add to that just in terms of reactive inspections. What I heard maybe in the first few weeks of the COVID situation was a lot of engagements on a work refusal basis, and usually related to PPE in the workplaces. And what I heard at that time was that when the ministry was attending, whether it was in person or virtually, the tendency was usually to returning the employee to work and finding that there was no inherent reason to back up work refusals.
All right. And it doesn't look like we've got any more questions coming in, and we are 3 minutes to the top of the hour. So I think we are in a good place to just thank you to our panel members. Certainly we appreciate their insights that they've been able to leave with us today. Thank you all for participating. We'll certainly share a copy of the recording early next week, along with some wellness resources that you might find helpful for your staff. And many of you gave us some good food for thought for potential future conversations like this. So